part of 1950s counterculture, you could also talk about civil rights in the same vein, that this was going against the norm. And in class, I asked you to name who you think is the most effective civil rights leader in America. And you guys had great suggestions. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X. You went even back to Ida B. Wells or Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois. But I argued that the answer was Jackie Robinson, the man who broke the color line in American baseball. And how fitting that we are now in spring and baseball season has just begun. When Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, he was the first black man in an all-white profession. He was such a good player that this wasn't necessarily intended to make a statement. They just wanted a good player, but it ended up being a political statement. And I showed you the preview from the movie 42. And I love the line when the owner says, I don't want a player who's strong enough to fight. I want a player who is strong enough not to fight. And this was incredibly challenging for Robinson personally. He had teammates who didn't want to play with him. He had opponents who didn't want to play against him. But through his excellence and through his patience, he really was able to open up a traditionally white industry and make it available for everyone. And the number 42, it's been retired because this is so significant that no one could ever again sort of replicate how huge this was. And I love this cartoon from 2008 that Obama, in becoming president, is the Jackie Robinson of politics. And as president number 44, that's pretty significant. President Harry Truman really wanted to help out what he saw as the plight of the African American community. And this makes sense given his background as a Democrat, vice president of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But the challenge that President Truman had was the Congress. He had tried to get laws passed outlawing lynching in a federal law, to eliminate poll taxes in a federal law. But because Congress is made up and includes people from the South, this wasn't really possible. And Truman hated this. He thought that it was limiting the equality of opportunity, which is such an American idea. America does not promise that things will be equal, but the equality of opportunity. So because he couldn't get these laws passed through Congress, he does it with an executive order, and in 1948 desegregates the armed forces. I love this headline because on the same front page, there's a headline about lynching. So this really was necessary that it was an executive order. And with this, we come full circle from the story of the 54th of Massachusetts, as well as the Tuskegee Airmen. Another issue for Black Americans is separate but equal, the idea that was established in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson court case. The problem, really, and at the most basic level, was education. And so in 1954, the NAACP helped bring the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka to the Supreme Court. And it was arguing that having separate but equal schools really were not equal. This was an incredible case because it did decide that separate but equal was not acceptable anymore. And so it forced the integration of the public schools. And what's great about this, it was a unanimous decision, which almost never happens. And I love this picture. It is so 1950s, equating the idea of integration as possibly being a communist tactic. We have that Red Scare that we are afraid of communism. So anything that we are afraid of, we will equate it to communism. The year after Brown v. Board, in 1955, we have the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a high schooler born and raised in Chicago, but in the summer of 1955, he was visiting family in Mississippi. And he happened to speak to a girl just outside the grocery store, just being polite. But what he didn't know, that girl, Carolyn Bryant, was just 21 years old, pretty white girl, and was married to the owner of that grocery store. And he saw this black boy talking to his white wife. Well, a few days later, Emmett was abducted from his uncle's house, and his body was discovered several days later in the local river. His body, not only had it been put in the river, but his body had been mutilated and shot. And of course, this would cause great sorrow. But his mother insisted on an open casket funeral so that everyone could see what had happened to her son. She wanted the world to see, and it gained world attention, that this is a real issue in America. Also in 1955, we have Rosa Parks refusing to change seats on the bus, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama. For over a year, the black community refused to ride on the Montgomery bus system. They would ride bikes, they would walk, they would carpool. And one of the leaders of that boycott was, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. So he'll come to national prominence with this, which will ultimately propel him into the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then the other example we have of the civil rights movement in the 1950s is the Little Rock Nine. Now, in 1954, when the Supreme Court overturned separate but equal with Brown versus the board, it's not expecting schools to desegregate overnight. It allowed public schools until 1957 to desegregate. In southern states, this was going to be very difficult, and desegregation would have to be very purposeful. So 9 black students were chosen to attend Central High School, and they were excellent students. And this was because they didn't want there to be any argument or reason about why these students would fail. But the governor of Arkansas decided to bring in the National Guard, so the state troopers essentially, to prevent these students from being able to attend. It wasn't until the mayor of Little Rock called President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower sends the 101st Airborne to escort these troops into school. And you can see from this picture that the local population, the students, were not pleased about this. They saw this as the government infringing on states' rights. But just like with the integration of the armed forces, this is much bigger than just states' rights.